The room did not have a name, but in the quiet hours of his observation, Elias Vance had given it one: the sterile glass cage. It was a perfect sphere of transparent plasteel suspended in the heart of Apex Station, a silent bubble against the infinite, star-dusted velvet of space. Inside, the air was recycled, tasteless, and held at a temperature so precisely controlled that one could forget the concept of warmth or cold. It was a chamber built for the extraction of pure, unadulterated fact. His interrogator, Judge Zaltar, was a being seemingly designed for such a place. A member of the Lumen, Zaltar's crystalline form was less a body and more a living lattice of information. He did not speak with a voice, but with soft, flowing ripples of light that pulsed across his faceted skin, a language of pure mathematics, translated into sterile, universal syntax by a small disk floating beside him. The light was a cool, analytical blue now, the color of a placid, bottomless ocean. "The official report is insufficient," the disk droned, translating the lumen's serene light show. "It details a catastrophic failure of Concordat technology, a breakdown of established protocols, and the loss of 17 highly esteemed scientific minds. Yet it offers no logical explanation. It reads like a chaotic fiction. You are the sole unimpaired survivor, environmental risk analyst Vance. We require an explanation that adheres to reason." Vance's gaze drifted past the judge, to the starfield visible through the armored viewport. Logic. They always started with logic. It had been the same on the Stargazer, the research vessel that had carried them to the jewel of the Concordat's discovery program. Xylos. Even the name sounded like a whisper, like the rustle of leaves in a gentle breeze. From orbit, it was a perfect marble of emerald green and sapphire blue, unblemished by axial tilt or atmospheric turbulence. The planetary classification was a thing of beauty, a flawless string of data that painted a picture of absolute paradise. Sanctuary World, Class 1. The designation read, "The safest category possible. A world without predators, without toxins, without geological instability. A planet where the evolutionary struggle had, somehow, reached a state of perfect, harmonious equilibrium." The memory was so clear it felt more real than the sterile room around him. He could almost feel the gentle hum of the Stargazer's transport deck as the team assembled for their first descent. Dr. Kalin, the lead xenobiologist, a Cathar, Kalin was a magnificent creature, a being of feline grace and predatory power, his species having conquered their own world and now sought to catalog all others. His confidence was as vast and impressive as his physical stature. "Perfection," he had declared, his deep voice resonating with the pride of his species. "Absolute, quantifiable perfection. Our mission is to observe, to document, and to confirm that the sanctuary doctrine holds true. Our technology is flawless. Our protocols are absolute. There will be no surprises here." The others had shared his enthusiasm. Lyra, the Glypton botanist, a slow-moving creature of living silicon, had shimmered with a quiet curiosity that was her species' equivalent of joy. The rest of the team, a curated collection of the Concordat's brightest minds, were buzzing with the thrill of setting foot in a true utopia. But as Elias Vance stood among them, looking at the same data streams, the same perfect environmental readings, he felt nothing but a deep, ancestral cold. On the transport down, while the others pointed out the breathtaking vistas of crystalline rivers and forests that shimmered with bioluminescence, Vance simply watched. He saw the world they saw, but his mind, a product of a far different kind of planet, was processing it through another filter. And what he saw was wrong. When their boots touched the soft, mossy ground of Xylos, the air was sweet, filled with the scent of unknown blossoms. The light was a soft, diffused gold filtering through a canopy of impossible beauty. Yet Vance had heard only silence, not the peace of an untouched world, but the heavy, expectant quiet of a held breath. There were no insect calls, no birdsong, no distant rustle of small creatures in the undergrowth. There was only the sound of their own team, an intrusion in a silent cathedral. He had walked to the edge of the clearing they chose for their main camp. The flora grew in patterns that were too perfect, too symmetrical, like a garden planted by a divine, obsessive hand. And the ground, it was clean, too clean. There was no rot, no fallen leaves turning to soil, no sign of the beautiful, necessary cycle of death and rebirth that fueled every ecosystem he had ever studied. It was a world without decay, a world without a past. Back in the sterile glass cage, the cool blue light of Judge Zaltar pulsed with impatience. "These are aesthetic observations, Mr. Vance. Sentimental, perhaps, but irrelevant to the catastrophic failure of Concordat technology." Elias Vance finally pulled his gaze from the stars and met the unwavering light of the lumen. His expression was one of profound, soul-deep exhaustion. "Logic is only as sound as its initial data, Judge, and your data was missing the most important variable of all." A flicker of violet, the lumen color for curiosity, touched Zaltar's crystalline edges. "And what variable was that?" Vance leaned forward slightly, the first real movement he had made. "The planet's perspective."
In the sterile glass cage, the violet light of curiosity on Zaltar's form faded back to a cool, analytical blue. "The planet's perspective," the translator repeated, the word perspective carrying a distinct tone of skepticism. "Ascribing motive to a geological formation is not a logical starting point for analysis, Mr. Vance." "It's not about motive, Judge," Vance replied, his voice still low, measured. "It's about behavior. On my world, we learned that every environment has a baseline, a rhythm. Xylos had no rhythm. It had a profound, waiting stillness. That stillness was the first variable your data was missing. And so, in the memory that played behind his eyes, he had tried to introduce a disruption, a human note, into that deafening silence. On their second day, as the main research hub was being assembled, a gleaming structure of smart alloys and self-deploying labs, Vance approached Dr. Kalin. He held a simple data pad displaying a schematic that looked laughably primitive against the backdrop of Concordat technology. He called it the Threshold Protocol, a human protocol compiled from centuries of forgotten expeditions and failed colonies on worlds far less forgiving than this one was supposed to be. The first step was the simplest. "We should dig a trench," Vance said, pointing to a perimeter line on his schematic, about a meter deep around the entire camp. Kalin had actually paused his work to stare, his magnificent feline face a mask of disbelief. Trench?" the Kethar repeated, as if the word itself was an alien concept. "Analyst Vance, we are protected by a Series 9 energy shield, capable of repelling micrometeorites. What purpose would a ditch possibly serve?" "It's not for repelling, Doctor," Vance had tried to explain. "It's for observing. It breaks the surface, disrupts the topsoil. It gives us a clear line of sight to see if anything tries to cross it, either over or under." He then suggested they limit the camp's energy emissions to specific narrow frequencies and establish rotating manual watch points manned by living observers, not just automated sensors. A low growl of amusement rumbled in Kalen's chest. "Superstition," he declared, loud enough for the others to hear.
the barbaric rituals of a species that fears the dark. We are scientists of the Concordat. We deal in quantifiable data, not ghost stories. Our sensors are 1,000 times more perceptive than your fragile human eyes." The others had chuckled, turning back to their sophisticated work, leaving Vance alone with his primitive fears. He had been dismissed, but not deterred. He spent the next cycle walking the perimeter himself, doing the only thing his protocol allowed him to do alone. He watched. And on the third day, the crack in paradise appeared. Kalen, in his boundless confidence, had authorized the deployment of a geoskimmer drone. It was a marvel of engineering, a silent, hovering disk designed to collect geological and botanical samples with microscopic precision. It glided effortlessly from the camp, a gleaming teardrop against the emerald forest. The team watched its progress on the main holographic display, a real-time feed of data streaming back. The drone's sensors reported perfect conditions: stable soil, benign flora, zero atmospheric contaminants. It hovered for a moment before a particularly dense thicket of iridescent bell-shaped flowers, extending a delicate manipulator arm to snip a sample. The arm touched the flower, and the signal went dead. Not a burst of static, not a final garbled data packet, not an emergency beacon, just nothing. One moment the drone was there, a solid, tangible piece of advanced technology. The next, its icon on the map simply vanished. The data stream ceased to exist. Silence descended upon the command hub. Kalen was the first to speak, his voice tight. "A cascade failure. A flaw in the power conduit. Run a diagnostic." But the diagnostics returned nothing, because there was nothing to diagnose. The drone was no longer a part of the network. It was as if it had never been. "I'm going to the location," Kalen announced, his pride wounded. Vance spoke up, his voice cutting through the rising confusion. "No one should go alone, and no one should go in there." He pointed at the screen, at the harmless-looking thicket of flowers. Kalen scoffed. "It was an equipment malfunction, analyst." "Then where's the wreckage?" Vance asked quietly. "A power failure would cause it to drop. We should see a signal from its impact with the ground. We should see broken branches. We should see something." Kalen, flanked by 2 security officers, ignored him and strode out of the hub. They reached the thicket moments later, their own suit cameras now feeding back to the display. The patch of forest was pristine. The bell-shaped flowers swayed gently. There was no drown, no impact crater. Not a single blade of moss was out of place. The ground, Kalen reported, his voice now laced with a thread of genuine confusion, was perfectly clean. Back in the present, Zoltar's light pattern shifted, a complex cascade of sapphire and silver. "The official log cites Kalen's hypothesis of a localized magnetic anomaly, causing the drone to malfunction and be subsumed by the soft terrain. This is a logical, if unlikely, possibility. You disagreed." "I did, because subsumed is a gentle word for what happened. Erased is more accurate. An anomaly might swallow a piece of equipment, Judge, but it doesn't tidy up afterwards." He leaned back, the memory of Kalen's confused face vivid in his mind. That was the moment the other scientists had stopped seeing him as a paranoid fool and started to feel the first cold touch of the same ancestral fear he felt. "Technology," Vance said, his gaze fixed on the Lumen interrogator, "is a tool, not a god. It is a brilliant tool for finding answers to the questions you already know how to ask, but it cannot search for a lie. And the fundamental nature of Xylos was a lie."
Inside the sterile glass cage, Judge Zoltar's Vom held a perfect stillness. The light that composed him seemed to dim for a fraction of a second, as if processing a concept that resisted classification. A lie, the translator echoed. Planets do not prevaricate, analyst Vance. They are amalgamations of rock and gas. They simply exist. This one didn't just exist, Vance said, the memory now pulling him under completely. It hunted, and its camouflage was perfection itself. It hid by being the very thing we expected to see. He closed his eyes, and he was no longer in the cage, but back in the golden twilight of Xylos, on the night the lie came undone. The mood in the camp had soured. The easy confidence of the first 2 days had evaporated, replaced by a brittle tension that hummed just beneath the surface, quieter but far more menacing than the silent forest. Kalen maintained a facade of authority, but his orders were sharper, his movements less fluid. He'd tripled the power to the energy shield, turning the camp into a glowing dome of defiance against the encroaching dark. It was a gesture of dominance, a technological roar into the silence, but it felt to Vance like a child whistling in a graveyard. The other scientists moved with a forced purpose, checking and rechecking instruments that had told them nothing was wrong, their faith in data wavering against the simple, undeniable fact of a vanished drone. Night fell not as a gentle blanket, but as a sudden, suffocating curtain. The forest's alien bioluminescence began to glow, casting the camp in an ethereal, shifting light of blues and greens. It was beautiful, but it was the beauty of a deep-sea predator, a lure in the crushing dark. Vance had found a position near the edge of the shield, holding a simple chemical flare stick, a piece of emergency equipment so archaic the others had mocked it. He wasn't watching the forest, he was watching the ground beneath his feet. It was Lyra, the Glypton, who saw it first. Her perception of time was slower, more deliberate, and perhaps that was why she noticed the change. She was standing near the center of the camp, observing a magnificent multi-petaled flower that had bloomed near the HU bit. Curious, she communicated through her suit's text-to-speech function, her voice a series of synthesized chimes. The specimen was facing east when we logged it at sundown. Its heliotropic rhythm should be dormant, yet it is now facing me. A collective chill went through the few who heard her. All eyes turned to the flower, and as they watched, it moved. With a slow, deliberate, and utterly impossible grace, the blossom rotated on its fixed stem, its face turning away from Lyra and toward another scientist who had just moved past it. It was tracking them. And then Kalen's voice, tight with alarm, crackled over the comms from inside the command hub. The shield integrity is at 100%. All external sensors are green. But, my God, the biomass readings inside the perimeter are fluctuating. That was when the first scream came. It wasn't a scream of terror, but of pained surprise. One of the junior botanists, standing near the edge of the camp, stumbled. He looked down to see a thick, green tendril, no different than the thousands of vines that carpeted the forest floor, wrapped tightly around his ankle. Before he could raise an alarm, a second and third vine snaked up his leg, and with a soft, wet, tearing sound, he was pulled down into the moss. He vanished, as completely as the drone had. The lie was revealed. The enemy wasn't outside the shield. The shield had been built on top of it. The entire planet, the soil, the moss, the beautiful, silent flora was a single continent-spanning carnivorous organism. The attack did not come with roars or explosions. It came with the quiet, inexorable certainty of a growing plant. From the ground they stood on, roots as hard and sharp as obsidian lances erupted, punching through the metal floor of the research hub with contemptuous ease. The beautiful bell-shaped flowers all turned in unison and released a fine, shimmering pollen into the air. It wasn't a poison. It was a psychotropic agent. Scientists began clawing at their helmets, screaming at phantom shapes only they could see. The advanced Concordat sensors couldn't detect a threat they weren't programmed to recognize. They were calibrated to find intruders, not to realize the very ground was the intruder. Chaos reigned. Kalen, trapped in the compromised hub, roared orders that were lost in the static and screams. The energy shield flickered and died as the roots tore through its power conduits from below. The camp was plunged into the ghostly bioluminescence of the forest. And in the heart of the madness, Elias Vance moved. There was no panic in him, only a cold, focused clarity. He ignited the chemical flare. Its harsh crimson light cut through the hallucinogenic pollen, the raw heat causing the approaching roots to recoil. He saw a scientist trapped, a vine constricting around her torso. He didn't try to cut it. He slammed the hot flare against its base, and the tendril hissed and retreated. He yelled orders not into the comms, but with his own raw voice. Stay off the moss. Get onto the metal plating. Use heat. It hates heat. He fought with a brutal efficiency born not of training, but of instinct. He used a discarded metal pole to lever a scientist free from the ground that was trying to swallow him. He saw the glypton, Lyra, being slowly encased by hardening sap from a nearby tree. Her silicon-based biology was resistant, but she was being entombed. Vance shattered the tree's trunk with the pole, a desperate, violent act that felt like sacrilege, yet it was the only language the planet seemed to understand. He was not a soldier. He was a man who understood that paradise was often just a mask for a perfectly camouflaged hell. The others were fighting an enemy. He was simply fighting the planet itself, and it was a battle his species had been waging, in one form or another, since they first learned to fear the dark.
The memory faded, leaving behind the ghost of screams and the phantom smell of scorched flora. Elias Vance was back in the sterile, silent sphere. Before him, Judge Zoltar's crystalline form was no longer a placid, analytical blue. It was a turbulent, chaotic storm of shifting light, flashes of violet curiosity, pulses of silver confusion, and a new, deep indigo color that Vance's translators struggled to define, eventually settling on the word dissonance. "Impossible," the translator droned, but the word lacked its earlier certainty. The synthetic voice was flat, yet the light of the lumen screamed a silent refutation of everything it had ever known. The variables do not compute. There was no precedent in the Concordat's extensive archives for a planetary-scale mimic organism. There was no data from which to extrapolate a threat of this nature. It is a logical impossibility that you, a single analyst with Class 3 clearance, could predict this outcome. Elias Vance slowly shook his head, a gesture of immense weariness. It wasn't a prediction, Judge. It was pattern recognition. My entire species is a pattern recognition engine, designed for a single purpose, to find the predator in the garden. Zoltar's light pulsed, the indigo deepening. Elaborate. The logic is failing. The threshold protocol, Vance began, his voice taking on a new resonance, like a scholar reciting an ancient grim text. You saw it as a list of superstitious instructions, but it isn't a checklist. It's a philosophy. It's a summary of 1 billion tragedies, written in the blood and ash of a world that never knew peace. Every rule is a memorial to a catastrophe we survived. He reached into his simple gray tunic and removed a small, worn cylinder of dark metal, featureless save for a single stud. You lumens seek knowledge in data. We were forced to find ours in scars. He pressed the stud. The device didn't project a hologram. It did something far more intimate, far more invasive. It released a cognitive echo, a legacy of perception that washed through the sterile room. Zoltar's light form convulsed as the raw, unfiltered experience of another world's history flooded his logical mind. There were no dates, no names, only feelings and images, brutal and swift, a flicker of firelight against a cave wall, illuminating wide, terrified eyes. Outside, in a darkness absolute, a sound, a twig snapping under a heavy paw, the guttural snarl of a saber-tooth. The image carried with it the primal, paralyzing fear of being prey. "We learned to fear the dark," Vance narrated, quiet and somber. "We learned that silence is not peace, but the moment before the pounce." Rule 1. Establish a defensible perimeter and maintain a manual watch. The image shifted. A medieval city, shrouded in a sickly fog. A cart piled high with bodies, their skin marked with black sores. A man in a grotesque bird-like mask turns, his eyes hollow behind the glass lenses. The echo was not of a predator, but of a plague, an invisible enemy that turned your neighbor, your family, into a source of death. We learned that threats don't always have teeth. We learned they can be carried on the wind or in a simple touch. Rule 7. Assume all alien life is a potential biohazard until proven otherwise. Limit direct contact. The echo tore itself apart, reforming into a vast, frozen tundra under a weak sun. Shaggy behemoths fell, pierced by flint-tipped spears. But the true enemy was the wind, the biting cold that stole the warmth from your bones, the relentless, grinding hunger of a world encased in ice. We learned the planet itself is not our friend. It will starve you, freeze you, and bury you without a second thought. Rule 12. Never trust an environment to be stable. Look for the cracks. Look for what's wrong. The echo screamed forward in time. Mud, rain, and barbed wire in a war-torn trench. The enemy was no longer a beast or a sickness, but a reflection of themselves, firing from the other side. Then a blinding white light, a pillar of fire reaching to the heavens, and the silhouette of a city turning to dust. The quiet horror of a world where they had finally created a predator more terrible than any nature could conceive. And finally, Vance whispered, as the echo faded, leaving a profound silence in its wake, we learned the most important lesson of all. The most dangerous, unpredictable, and relentlessly hostile organism in the known universe is us. The final rule: trust your instincts, not your hopes. He deactivated the device and slipped it back into his tunic. Judge Zaltar was no longer blue or violet or indigo. His crystalline body was awash in a color that had no name in the lumen spectrum, a shimmering, frantic cascade of pure, unfiltered emotion. It was the color of a paradigm shattering. It was the color of a being of pure logic being forced to comprehend millions of years of illogical, brutal, beautiful survival. "You evolved in that," the translator stammered, the first time its syntax had ever faltered. "We survived it," Vance corrected softly, "and it left its mark on us. We are the children of 1,000 apocalypses. When your astronomers looked at Xylos, they saw a sanctuary. When I looked at it, I saw an ecosystem with no visible signs of competition, predation, or decay, and my entire genetic history screamed at me that it was a trap. Our paranoia is not a flaw. It is the scar tissue of survival, our most essential, hard-won tool." Zaltar's light slowly, painfully, began to coalesce back into a stable form, a deep, contemplative silver. The lumen had come seeking a logical explanation for a technological failure. He had instead been given a lesson in the philosophy of a species forged in a crucible he could barely comprehend. He finally understood. Elias Vance had not been looking at the planet at all. He had been looking for the shape of the teeth he could not yet see.
The silver light of Judge Zaltar's form held steady for a long, silent moment. The cognitive echo had faded, but its ghost remained, a stain of visceral reality upon the sterile logic of the room. The history of humanity, a frantic, desperate, and unbroken chain of survival against impossible odds had been downloaded into the core of his being. The judge had come to this room seeking a single fact. He was now burdened with the wisdom of 1 billion deaths. When the translator finally spoke, the synthetic voice was different. The cadence was slower, imbued with a weight it had not possessed before. The interrogation is concluded. There was a pause, and Vance saw the light within the lumen's crystalline body rearrange itself, forming a new, complex pattern of deep, resolute silver. It was the color of a verdict that would reshape an era. I will be submitting my findings to the Concordat High Council. My report will conclude that the sanctuary doctrine is not merely flawed, it is a failure of imagination. It is the product of a peaceful federation that has forgotten the nature of a true predator. It will be my formal recommendation that the human threshold protocol, this philosophy etched in scar tissue, be studied, integrated, and adopted as the new standard for all Concordat exploratory missions. We have been operating under the assumption that the universe is a library to be cataloged. Your species has reminded us that it is a wilderness to be survived. The door to the sterile glass cage hissed open. Elias Vance was free. He walked out not as a suspect, but as the harbinger of a grim new enlightenment. He found his way to an observation deck, a vast expanse of plasteel, looking out onto the silent dance of nebulae and distant galaxies. He needed to see the stars, to remind himself of the scale of the void after being so deeply immersed in the claustrophobic struggles of his own world's past. He wasn't alone for long. A presence, large and silent, approached from behind. It was Dr. Kalin. The magnificent Cathar was one of only 3 other survivors, and the arrogance he had once worn like a mantle was gone, stripped away by the silent fury of Xylos. His fur was dull, his movements heavy with a grief that seemed to have aged him centuries. Kalin said nothing. He simply stood beside Vance, and in a gesture of profound significance, he lowered his head and flattened his ears, a sign of ultimate deference in Cathar culture, an acknowledgement of a superior not in rank, but in wisdom. You taught us a lesson, analyst Vance. The Cathar finally rumbled, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. One that cost us everything. He looked out at the starfield. We were so proud of our technology, so certain in our data. We never realized that the most dangerous predator in any system is not the creature with the sharpest teeth, but the quiet voice in your own mind that tells you that you are safe. Vance finally turned, and his eyes held not triumph, but a shared deep-seated sorrow. I'm sorry for your loss, Doctor. Truly. Kalin gave a slow, somber nod. They are gone, but the lesson remains. And with that, the proud scientist made a silent pilgrimage of grief and respect, leaving Vance alone with the stars once more. And so, a new doctrine began to spread through the arteries of the Galactic Concordat. It was unofficially known as the Vance Doctrine, and it was met with resistance at first, then grudging acceptance, and finally with a reverence reserved for sacred texts. Exploration teams were now required to include a human risk analyst. Training simulations were redesigned no longer based on predictable threats, but on the illogical, asymmetrical, and terrifyingly patient nature of humanity's ancestral fears. The species of the Concordat began to look at humans differently. They were no longer the loud, emotional, chaotic newcomers. They were seen as something far older, like a quiet, unassuming caretaker who reveals he was once a legendary warrior.
They were the galaxy's elders of survival. Other races brought gifts of advanced physics, of elegant starship design, of medical wonders. Humanity brought their scars. They brought their paranoia, their ingrained distrust, their unshakable belief that in any paradise, the serpent is not a possibility, but an inevitability. They brought the terrifying and priceless gift of a history that had never, for a single moment, allowed them the luxury of feeling safe. For in the grand, silent theater of the cosmos, they were the only ones who had never forgotten the feeling of being hunted, and in doing so, had become the ultimate survivors.